In the autumn of 1882, a lonely cattle rancher named Samuel Dre stood at the Clearwater train depot holding a photograph of a woman he'd never met. She was supposed to be his wife. He'd paid $17 for a newspaper advertisement and exchanged exactly 9 letters with a woman named Clara Weber from Philadelphia. She described herself as plain, honest, and willing to work. She said nothing about the skill she carried with her. A skill so rare and so valuable that within 6 months, it would be the only thing standing between Samuel's ranch and total ruin. But when the train pulled into the station that October afternoon, something was already wrong. The woman who stepped off the railcar looked nothing like the photograph. She was taller, thinner, and her eyes held a kind of sharpness that the soft portrait hadn't captured. She carried one leather trunk and a rectangular wooden case that she kept pressed against her body like a child. When Samuel reached for it to help her, she pulled it back with a firmness that startled him. "I'll carry this one myself," she said. "Now before we go any further, I want you to think about this. What do you think was inside that case? Drop your guess in the comments below because I promise you, most people never get this right." The answer changed everything. This is the true-to-era story of how a mail-order bride from the East saved a dying ranch in Montana Territory. Not with money, not with connections, but with a secret skill that nobody saw coming. Samuel Dre had not always been a lonely man. 5 years earlier, he'd been part of a family. His wife, Margaret, and their young son, Thomas, had made the homestead along Elk Creek feel like something more than just land and cattle. But the winter of 1877 had been savage. Pneumonia swept through the valley like a reaper's scythe, and by March, Samuel was digging 2 graves in frozen ground with a pickaxe and tears that froze against his cheeks before they could fall. After that, the ranch became a kind of prison. Samuel worked it because he didn't know how to do anything else. He ran about 200 head of cattle across 1,200 acres of Montana grassland. He had one hired hand, an aging cowboy named Buford Sims, who had a bad hip and a worse temperament. Together, they managed. Barely. It was Buford who first suggested the mail-order bride idea. "You ain't living, Sam," Buford had said one evening, whittling a stick by the fire. "You're just dying real slow. Get yourself a wife. Even a stranger's better than talking to me every night." Samuel resisted the idea for nearly a year. But loneliness has a weight to it. A physical heaviness that presses down on a man's chest when he wakes up in an empty house, when he eats alone, when the only sounds at night are the wind and the cattle lowing in the dark. Eventually, he placed the advertisement. The responses trickled in slowly. Most were from women in desperate circumstances, widows with children, women fleeing bad situations, women looking for any kind of stability. Samuel read each letter carefully. He wasn't looking for beauty or charm. He was looking for honesty. Clara Weber's first letter stood out because it was different. She didn't describe herself with flattery or false modesty. She wrote clearly, precisely, almost like a person accustomed to documenting facts rather than feelings. She stated her age as 31, which was considered late for marriage in that era. She said she had no children and no living parents. She had worked as a clerk in a Philadelphia dry goods store for 8 years. She wanted to leave the city. "I am not a romantic woman," she had written in her 3rd letter. "I do not expect love at first sight or a fairy tale. I expect hard work, mutual respect, and a chance to be useful. If you can offer those things, I believe we can build something worth having." Samuel had read that letter 3 times. Then he sent the train fare. Now, standing at the depot watching this unfamiliar woman step down from the railcar, Samuel felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Relief that she had actually come, anxiety about what came next, and a strange, nagging curiosity about the wooden case she refused to let go of. "Mrs. Weber?" he asked, removing his hat. "Miss Weber," she corrected. "We're not married yet, Mr. Dre." He almost smiled. Almost. The ride back to the ranch took nearly 2 hours by wagon. Clara sat beside him on the bench seat, her trunk in the back, the wooden case on her lap. She looked at the landscape with an expression Samuel couldn't quite read. It wasn't awe exactly. It wasn't fear. It was something more like assessment. as though she were measuring the land, calculating its potential and its dangers with equal precision. "It's bigger than I imagined," she said at one point. "The land. Everything. The sky, the distance between things. In Philadelphia, you can see from one end of a street to the other and know exactly where you are. Out here," she paused. "Out here, you could disappear." "Some people do," Samuel said quietly. They were married 3 days later by a circuit preacher named Reverend Hollis who rode through the valley once a month. The ceremony took less than 10 minutes. Buford served as witness. There was no ring because Samuel hadn't thought to buy one, and Clara said she didn't need one. They signed the papers, shook hands with the Reverend, and then Clara went inside to begin unpacking her things. That evening, Samuel noticed the wooden case sitting on the bedroom dresser. It was about 2 feet long, made of dark walnut, with brass latches. "May I ask what's in there?" he said. Clara looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding something. Then she turned away. "Tools," she said. "For my work." She didn't elaborate, and Samuel, being a man who understood the value of privacy, didn't push. But the answer would come soon enough. And when it did, it would change everything. The first month of their marriage was an awkward dance of 2 strangers learning to share a life. Clara was efficient and tireless. She rose before dawn, cooked meals that were simple but well prepared, cleaned the house with a methodical thoroughness, and even helped with lighter ranch chores without being asked. She mended fences, organized the barn, and kept a ledger of household expenses that was more detailed than anything Samuel had ever seen. Buford warmed to her quickly. "She ain't soft," he told Samuel one morning while they were saddling horses. "I like that. Soft people don't last out here." Samuel agreed, but there was something about Clara that kept him at a distance. She was kind but guarded. She answered questions directly but never volunteered information about her past beyond what she'd written in her letters. And she never opened the wooden case, at least not when anyone was watching. The cattle business in Montana Territory in the early 1880s was a complicated and often brutal enterprise. The open range system meant that ranchers like Samuel grazed their herds on vast stretches of unfenced public land. Ownership was determined by brands, and disputes were common. The nearest law was in the town of Clearwater, 20 miles away, and the sheriff there, a man named Dale Whitmore, was known more for his drinking than his enforcement of justice. Samuel's ranch sat in a vulnerable position. Elk Creek Valley was prime grazing land, with good water and natural shelter from winter winds. For years, Samuel had shared the range with 2 other small ranchers, and they'd maintained an informal agreement about boundaries and water rights. But in the summer of 1882, everything changed. A cattleman named Harlan Voss had moved into the region. Voss was not a homesteader or a small operator. He was a businessman from Chicago who had formed an investment company to capitalize on the beef boom. He bought out 3 ranches to the north and consolidated them into a single massive operation called the Voss Land and Cattle Company. He ran over 3,000 head and employed a crew of 15 men, some of whom were cowboys and some of whom were something considerably less respectable. Voss wanted the valley. The first sign of trouble came in November, when Samuel found a section of his fence cut and about 40 head of his cattle missing. The tracks led north, toward Voss's range. Samuel rode to the Voss ranch to inquire about his cattle, and he was met at the gate by a foreman named Briggs, a tall man with a scar across his jaw and no interest in conversation. "Ain't seen your cattle," Briggs said. "Maybe they wandered. Through a cut fence?" Briggs shrugged. "Wire breaks. Weather does that." Samuel rode home empty-handed. A week later, another 20 head were gone. Then his neighbor to the east, a rancher named Perkins, rode over to say that Voss had made him an offer for his land. A low offer. Insultingly low. "He told me I could take the money or I could take my chances," Perkins said, his face pale. "What do you think he meant by that, Sam?" Samuel knew exactly what it meant. The pattern was familiar across the West. Large cattle companies had been swallowing small ranchers for years. They used economic pressure, legal manipulation, and when those failed, intimidation and violence. The Johnson County War in Wyoming, which would erupt just a decade later, would be the most famous example. But smaller, quieter versions of that conflict were playing out across the frontier throughout the 1880s. By December, Samuel had lost nearly 80 head of cattle. At market prices of roughly $35 a head, that represented nearly $2,800 in losses, a staggering sum for a small rancher. His operating margin was already thin. Another season of losses like this, and he would be finished. Clara watched all of this quietly. She asked questions, studied the account books, listened when Samuel and Buford discussed the situation by the fire. But she offered no opinions and no solutions. Until the night of December 14th. Samuel came in from the cold, exhausted and frustrated after spending the day tracking cattle that seemed to vanish into the frozen landscape. Clara had supper ready. They ate in silence. When the plates were cleared, Clara sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table. "Mr. Dre," she said, and she still called him that, formal and precise. "I need to show you something." She went to the bedroom and returned with the wooden case. She set it on the table, unlatched the brass clasps, and opened the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of green velvet, was the most extraordinary set of surveying instruments Samuel had ever seen. A brass transit compass, a set of drafting tools, measuring chains, a spirit level, and several leather-bound notebooks filled with meticulous handwriting and geometric drawings. "I'm a surveyor," Clara said. "I apprenticed under my father for 12 years. He was one of the best in Pennsylvania. I've mapped property lines, rail routes, and mining claims from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh." Samuel stared at the instruments, then at her. "Why didn't you tell me?" Clara's expression was steady. "Because in 9 states and territories, a woman cannot hold a surveyor's license. I was denied certification 3 times despite passing every examination. I was told it was not a woman's profession." She paused. "I stopped telling people because I was tired of being dismissed. But right now, Mr. Dre, I believe you need what I can do." Surveying in the American West was one of the most important and underappreciated professions of the frontier era. The entire system of land ownership, from homestead claims to railroad grants to mining rights, depended on accurate surveys. The General Land Office in Washington oversaw the process, but the actual work was done by surveyors in the field, men who walked the land with compass and chain, establishing the grid of sections, townships, and ranges that divided the Western territories into ownable parcels. The system was based on the Public Land Survey System, established in 1785, which divided land into 6-mile-square townships, each containing 36 sections of 1 square mile, or 640 acres, each. Homesteaders like Samuel could claim 160 acres under the Homestead Act of 1862, but additional land could be purchased or leased, and boundaries were determined by survey markers, iron pins, stone monuments, and blazed trees that established the legal limits of each property. The problem was that surveys were often inaccurate, incomplete, or deliberately falsified. Corrupt surveyors could be bribed to move markers or alter records, and in remote territories, the original survey monuments were frequently lost, destroyed, or never placed at all. This created a landscape of legal uncertainty that powerful interests could exploit. Clara believed this was exactly what Harlan Voss was doing. The morning after she revealed her instruments, Clara asked Samuel to show her the boundaries of his property. He took her on horseback to the corners of his claim, or at least to where he believed the corners were. His original homestead patent described the property in terms of sections and quarter sections, but the actual survey markers, which should have been iron pipes driven into the ground at each corner, were missing. "When did you last see the markers?" Clara asked. "I never looked for them," Samuel admitted. "I knew where my land was because I'd been told by the previous owner. Everybody around here just knows the boundaries by landmarks. That ridge, this creek, the old dead pine." Clara shook her head slowly. "That's exactly the problem. Informal boundaries are meaningless in a legal dispute. If Voss files a claim saying his property extends into this valley, and he has a survey to back it up, your word about where the old dead pine stands won't matter to a judge. Over the next 3 weeks, despite bitter cold and short days, Clara conducted a comprehensive survey of Samuel's property and the surrounding range. She worked with the transit compass mounted on a wooden tripod, sighting along section lines and recording angles with the precision of a trained engineer. She used the measuring chains, each exactly 66 feet long, to establish distances. She cross-referenced her measurements with the original township plat maps, which Samuel had a copy of from when he filed his homestead claim. What she found was alarming. First, 2 of Samuel's original corner markers had been physically removed. The iron pipes had been pulled from the ground, and the holes filled in. This was not the work of weather or animals. Someone had deliberately destroyed the survey monuments. Second, when Clara plotted the actual section lines based on her measurements and the original plat, she discovered that Samuel's property was larger than he'd been using. His homestead claim, combined with an additional quarter section he'd purchased from the Territorial Land Office in 1879, totaled 480 acres. But he'd been treating the ranch as though it extended only about 400 acres, ceding roughly 80 acres along the northern boundary to what he assumed was public range. Third, and most critically, Clara found evidence that someone had placed new survey markers, unofficial ones, along a line that cut deep into Samuel's legal property. These were wooden stakes, not iron pipes, and they bore no official markings. But they were placed in a deliberate line that, if accepted as legitimate, would reduce Samuel's ranch by nearly a third and give Voss's company control of the best water access on Elk Creek. "He's stealing your land," Clara said, spreading her notes on the kitchen table one evening. "Not with guns, with geometry. He's having someone resurvey this area with false lines, and when the time comes, he'll file those surveys with the Territorial Land Office and claim that his property extends to these new markers. Your original markers are gone, so you'll have nothing to counter with." Samuel felt a cold anger settle in his stomach. "Can we prove it?" "We can if I complete a full certified survey and file it first. The problem is certification." Clara tapped the table. "My work is accurate. I stake my life on it. But no territorial office will accept a survey filed by a woman. We need someone with a license to review my work and submit it under their name." Buford, who had been listening from his chair by the fire, spoke up. "There's a surveyor in Helena, name of Crenshaw. He did some work for the mining companies up near Butte. Heard he's honest." "Helena's 140 miles from here," Samuel said. "Then you'd better leave soon," Clara replied. "Because once Voss files his survey, our legal position becomes much more difficult." Samuel looked at his wife. This woman he barely knew. This stranger who had come to his home with a wooden case and a secret expertise, and for the first time since Margaret died, he felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. Samuel left for Helena on January 8, 1883, carrying Clara's survey notes, her plat drawings, and a letter she had written to the surveyor Crenshaw explaining her methodology and requesting his professional review. The letter was remarkable. It was written with the technical fluency of a trained professional and the diplomatic care of someone who knew her qualifications would be questioned. Clara also gave Samuel a sealed envelope. "If Crenshaw doubts the quality of the work, show him this." Inside was a letter of reference from a man named Professor Arthur Whitfield of the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia, one of the most respected scientific institutions in America. The letter, dated 1879, stated that Clara Weber had demonstrated exceptional competence in the science of geodetic surveying, and that her work exceeds in precision and thoroughness the output of many licensed practitioners known to this institution. Samuel tucked the envelope into his coat and rode north. The journey to Helena in January was punishing. Montana winters were legendary for their brutality. Temperatures dropped well below zero at night, and the wind across the open plains could cut through clothing like a blade. Samuel rode his strongest horse, a bay gelding named Hector, and carried enough provisions for a week. He followed the established trail north, stopping at way stations and homesteads where travelers could warm up and rest their animals. He reached Helena on the afternoon of January 12th, exhausted and half-frozen. Helena in 1883 was a boomtown, swollen with miners, merchants and speculators drawn by the gold discoveries of the previous 2 decades. It was also the territorial capital, which meant it had lawyers, land offices, and surveyors. Finding Crenshaw was not difficult. The man had an office on Last Chance Gulch, the city's main street. He was a small, wiry man in his 50s with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He looked more like a schoolteacher than a frontiersman, but his reputation was solid. Samuel presented Clara's work. Crenshaw examined the survey notes, the angle measurements, the chain distances, the computed positions, all of it spread across his desk under the light of a kerosene lamp. He said nothing for nearly an hour. Then he looked up. "Who did this work?" "My wife." Crenshaw removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly. "Your wife is a better surveyor than most men I've worked with. These computations are flawless. The closure error on this traverse is less than 1 part in 5,000. That's exceptional. Then you'll certify the survey?" Crenshaw leaned back. "It's not that simple. I'd need to verify some of the control points in the field. I won't put my name on work I haven't checked. But based on what I see here, I'm confident the survey is accurate." He paused. "There's something else. You say someone removed the original monuments and placed false markers. That's what my wife determined. If that's true, it's a federal crime. Destruction or alteration of public land survey monuments is a violation of federal law under the General Land Office statutes. Your man Voss could face serious legal consequences. Assuming anyone cares to enforce it." Crenshaw nodded slowly. "That's always the question out here, isn't it?" He tapped the papers on his desk. "I'll come out to your valley in February, as soon as the weather allows. I'll verify the survey, certify it, and we'll file it with the Territorial Land Office. In the meantime, I'd advise you to document everything. Every cut fence, every missing cow, every false marker. Evidence matters, Mr. Dre." Samuel started the ride home on January 14th. He traveled faster this time, driven by urgency and a growing sense that time was running out. He pushed Hector hard but not recklessly, and they made the return journey in 3.5 days. When he rode into the ranch yard on the evening of January 17th, he knew immediately that something had happened. The barn door was hanging open. One of the windows on the house was broken, patched with a piece of board from the inside, and Buford was sitting on the porch with a shotgun across his knees and a bandage around his left hand. "What happened?" Samuel dismounted before Hector had fully stopped. Buford spat tobacco juice into the snow. "3 of Voss's men came by 2 days ago," said Mr. Voss was making a final offer for the ranch. $300 for the whole spread. I told them where they could put their offer. And they didn't take kindly to the suggestion. Roughed me up some. Broke that window. Shot one of the dogs. Buford's voice was steady, but his eyes were hard. "Clara ran them off." Samuel looked at him. "Clara ran them off? She came out of the house with your Winchester rifle, put a round into the dirt about 6 inches in front of the lead man's boots, and told them the next one would be higher. They left." Samuel found Clara inside, calmly sewing the tear in a curtain that had been ripped during the altercation. She looked up when he came in. "Did you find Crenshaw?" she asked. "Yes. He'll come in February." "Good. Then we need to hold on until February." She went back to her sewing. "How was the ride?" Samuel sat down heavily in a chair. He looked at this woman, his wife of barely 3 months, who had faced down armed men with a rifle and then gone back to mending curtains. He realized that the photograph she'd sent had been wrong about more than just her appearance. It had failed entirely to capture the iron in her spine. "The ride was long," he said. "Clara, I need to ask you something." She looked up again. "Yes. Why did you really come out here? You're clearly educated. You had skills. You could have found other work in the East, maybe not as a surveyor, but something. Why come to Montana to marry a stranger?" Clara set down her needle. For the first time since he'd known her, something softened in her expression. It wasn't vulnerability exactly. It was honesty without armor. "Because I was tired of being invisible," she said. "In Philadelphia, I was a clerk. a spinster clerk who happened to know trigonometry. Nobody saw me. Nobody needed what I could actually do. When I read your advertisement, I thought, here is a man who needs a partner, not a decoration. I thought maybe out here what I know might actually matter. She picked up the needle again. Was I wrong? No, Samuel said quietly. You were not wrong. February brought no relief from the cold, but it brought Crenshaw. The surveyor arrived on February 9th with a pack mule carrying his own instruments. He spent 4 days in the field with Clara, verifying her survey, checking angles, remeasuring critical distances. Each evening, they sat at the kitchen table comparing notes while Samuel and Buford kept watch on the ranch. At the end of the 4th day, Crenshaw pronounced the survey verified. Your wife's work is impeccable, Mr. Dre. I'm certifying this survey and will file it with the Helena Land Office. I'll also file a formal complaint regarding the destroyed monuments and the placement of fraudulent markers. The General Land Office takes monument destruction seriously, at least on paper. But Voss was not a man who operated on paper timelines. He operated on pressure. The day after Crenshaw left for Helena with the certified survey documents, trouble escalated dramatically. Samuel woke before dawn to the smell of smoke. He threw on his boots and ran outside to find the hay barn on fire. The structure, which held most of the winter feed supply for the cattle, was fully engulfed by the time he reached it. There was nothing to do but watch it burn. In the orange light of the flames, Samuel saw hoofprints in the snow leading away to the north. Fresh tracks. At least 3 riders. The loss was devastating. Without hay, the cattle would starve before spring. Samuel had enough emergency feed to last maybe 2 weeks, but after that, he'd have to either buy hay at winter prices, which he couldn't afford, or start selling cattle at a loss. This is how Voss does it, Clara said that morning, standing in front of the smoking ruins. He doesn't need to take your land by force. He just needs to make it impossible for you to hold it. Destroy your feed, scatter your cattle, cut your fences. Bleed you dry until you sell because you have no choice. Then what do we do? Samuel asked. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, we go to Clearwater. We talk to everyone who will listen, and we make this a public fight. This was a crucial strategic insight, and it reflected a reality of frontier justice. In territories where law enforcement was thin and courts were distant, public opinion and community solidarity were often the only real protections a small rancher had. A man being quietly squeezed by a powerful neighbor could be destroyed in silence. But a man whose story was known, whose grievances were public, was much harder to dispose of without consequence. Clara understood this instinctively. Over the next week, Samuel and Clara rode to every ranch, farm, and homestead in the valley. They told their story. They showed Clara's survey maps, which demonstrated how Voss had been manipulating boundary lines. They described the missing cattle, the cut fences, the arson, the threats. And they asked a simple question. If Voss could do this to the Dre Ranch, who would be next? The response was slow at first. People were scared. Voss had money and men, and fear is a powerful silencer. But Clara had prepared something that proved devastatingly effective. She had used her surveying skills to create a detailed map of the entire valley, showing every ranch, every property line, every water source, and, critically, the pattern of Voss's expansion. The map made it visually undeniable that Voss was systematically absorbing the valley, one ranch at a time, using the same tactics of monument destruction and false surveys. When people could see the pattern, they couldn't unsee it. By the 3rd week of February, 12 ranchers had agreed to sign a joint petition to the territorial governor requesting an investigation into Voss's land practices. They also pooled resources. 3 ranchers contributed hay to replace what Samuel had lost. 2 others sent hired hands to help patrol the Dre Ranch at night. A merchant in Clearwater agreed to extend credit for supplies. The community had drawn a line. Voss's response came on February 28th. He rode to the Dre Ranch himself, accompanied by Briggs and 4 armed men. Samuel met them in the yard. Buford stood on the porch with the shotgun. Clara watched from the window, Harlan Voss was a thick-bodied man in his late 40s with a neatly trimmed beard and expensive clothes. He sat his horse with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Mr. Dre," Voss said, "I understand you've been talking to your neighbors about me. I've been telling them the truth. The truth is a flexible thing, Mr. Dre. I have surveys that show my property lines extend to Elk Creek. I have a licensed surveyor who'll testify to their accuracy. And I have a certified survey that shows those lines are fraudulent," Samuel replied. "Filed with the Territorial Land Office in Helena as of last week, along with a complaint to the General Land Office about destroyed federal survey monuments." For the first time, something shifted in Voss's expression. A flicker of calculation. He hadn't expected this. Small ranchers didn't file surveys. They didn't know about federal monument statutes. They simply gave way. "Who did your survey?" Voss asked. "A man named Crenshaw, out of Helena." "Crenshaw." Voss repeated the name. "I know Crenshaw. He's competent." The word sounded like an admission pulled through clenched teeth. "This doesn't change anything, Dre. I'll have my own survey reviewed and corrected. These things take time, and time is not your friend." "Maybe not," Samuel said, "but it's not yours either. Not anymore." Voss looked past Samuel to the house, where Clara stood in the window watching. His eyes lingered there for a moment. Then he turned his horse and rode away without another word. What followed was not a dramatic gunfight or a midnight showdown. The reality of frontier land disputes was usually more grinding and bureaucratic than the dime novels suggested. But it was no less consequential. In March of 1883, the Territorial Land Office in Helena received Crenshaw's certified survey of the Dre property, along with the formal complaint about destroyed monuments and fraudulent markers. The filing triggered a review process that, while slow, put Voss's land claims under official scrutiny. Simultaneously, the joint petition from the Valley Ranchers reached the territorial governor's office. The governor, a political appointee from Washington who was sensitive to the growing national debate about land monopolies in the West, forwarded the petition to the U.S. Marshal's office in Helena with a request for investigation. In April, a deputy U.S. Marshal named James Tolliver rode into the valley. He was a quiet, methodical man who spent 2 weeks interviewing ranchers, examining property records, and inspecting the sites where survey monuments had been destroyed. Clara's maps and survey documentation proved invaluable to his investigation. Tolliver later stated in his report that Mrs. Dre's work was of a professional standard that materially advanced the efficiency of this investigation. The investigation revealed what Clara had suspected from the beginning. Voss had employed a surveyor named Emmett Parrish to conduct fraudulent surveys of the valley, systematically moving boundary lines to expand Voss's claimed territory. Parrish, when confronted with the evidence, confessed to the scheme in exchange for leniency. He testified that Voss had paid him $200 per survey and instructed him specifically on where the false lines should be drawn. Parrish's confession was the key that unlocked everything. In June of 1883, a federal court in Helena issued an injunction against the Voss Land and Cattle Company, prohibiting any further encroachment on properties in the Elk Creek Valley. Voss was ordered to pay restitution for stolen cattle, destroyed property, and legal costs to the affected ranchers. The total amount, determined over several months of legal proceedings, exceeded $12,000. Voss fought the judgment fiercely, hiring attorneys from Chicago and arguing that the surveys were legitimate disputes, not criminal fraud. But Parrish's testimony, combined with Clara's impeccable survey documentation and the physical evidence of destroyed monuments, made his case untenable. In November of 1883, the court upheld the injunction and the restitution order. Voss paid. He had no choice. But the financial blow, combined with the reputational damage, weakened his operations significantly. Over the following year, the Voss Land and Cattle Company sold off most of its Montana holdings and retreated to operations in Wyoming and Nebraska. By 1885, Voss himself had returned to Chicago, his dream of a Montana cattle empire in ruins. Samuel Dre received $1,700 in restitution, enough to rebuild his hay barn, replace the lost cattle, and put the ranch on solid financial footing for the first time in years. But the money, as significant as it was not the most important thing that came out of the ordeal. In the spring of 1884, Clara gave birth to a daughter. They named her Margaret, after Samuel's first wife. It was Clara's suggestion. She was part of this place, Clara said. Her name should stay here. Samuel, who had not cried since the day he buried his family 7 years earlier, wept at the kindness of it. The years that followed were not easy because years on a Montana ranch never were. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick cattle and broken equipment, the 1,000 small crises that make up a life on the land. But the ranch survived, and more than survived, it grew. Samuel expanded the herd to 400 head. He bought an additional quarter section. He hired 2 permanent hands to work alongside the aging but indestructible Buford Sims. Clara continued to survey. She mapped properties for neighbors, helped settle boundary disputes, and trained other ranchers to read plat maps and understand their property descriptions. She never received a surveyor's license. The territory, and later the state of Montana, did not grant one to a woman during her lifetime. But she was recognized by those who mattered, by the people whose land and livelihoods depended on the accuracy of lines drawn in the dirt. Crenshaw, the Helena surveyor, became a friend and correspondent. In a letter dated 1891, he wrote to Clara, "I have trained a dozen men in this profession, and not one of them approaches your natural ability. The profession's loss is its own doing, and I say that with both regret and admiration." Clara kept that letter in the wooden case alongside her instruments. Samuel and Clara's marriage, which had begun as a transaction between strangers, became something that neither of them had expected but both of them needed. It was not a passionate romance. They were not given to dramatic declarations or grand gestures. But they built a partnership based on exactly what Clara had promised in her 3rd letter. Hard work, mutual respect, and the chance to be useful. They proved that those things, plain as they might sound, were more than enough. Samuel Dray died in 1912, at the age of 67, from a heart ailment that had troubled him for several years. Clara lived until 1921, managing the ranch with the help of their daughter Margaret and Margaret's husband, a schoolteacher from Billings named Robert Crane. Clara was 70 years old when she died, and she was buried next to Samuel on the hill above Elk Creek, within sight of the survey markers she had placed 40 years earlier. The wooden case with its brass latches passed to Margaret, who kept it on the dresser in the same room where her mother had first placed it on that October evening in 1882. Inside, the instruments still gleamed, carefully oiled and maintained, ready for work. The ranch remained in the family for 3 more generations. And every fence post, every boundary line, every corner marker on that property stood exactly where Clara Weber Dray had measured it, precise to the last degree, immovable as the mountains that watched over the valley. Because in the end, the West was not won by the fastest gun or the biggest herd. It was won by the people who knew where the lines were and who had the courage to defend them.